My lecture today is going to be a bit general. It's kind of walking through time and space, from global to regional, maybe less local. And I am told that majority of you are either at the stages of your master's degree and others are undertaking PhDs. So the subject matter is simple enough even for those doing master's degree to understand. But there might be some elements that come up, and that is up to you to ask questions for further explanation, or actually we can discuss. And so when I talk about historical ecological perspectives on pastoralism in the Horn of Africa, actually I will also look at the situation in the Sahara or the Sahel region from historical perspectives, and then how that is linked to pastoralism in the Horn of Africa. Pastoralism is a very important subject, I am sure, and to do that, we will look at various subject matter. First, we will look at the framework within which we will describe pastoralism in Africa. We'll look at what is called rock art pastoralists, Neolithic pastoralists. And I am sure, I don't know if there is an archaeologist among us, but that we will explain. We'll talk about pastoralism, space, time, and knowledge, and we will have coastal commerce, interior caravan trade between AD 600 and 1900 in the Horn of Africa. This will be done very briefly. But I will highlight more, I think, on hydraulic societies in the Horn of Africa, because this is a fascinating subject matter. I think there is very little work done, but if you were a very voracious reader of various subjects, varied from trade, that is the oceanic trade, the interior continental trade, and so on, and then historical archives you go through, you will actually find a lot of information. But that only raises certain hypotheses. You might not have specific answers, and it is those hypotheses, some of them we'll talk about. We'll also talk something about socio-memory and climate events. I will surprise you in this lecture about climate change. I am sure many of us are very particular about climate change, and it has almost become a currency. And I think there's a misunderstanding here. Is climate change something recent? Or is it historical that has been going on for the period of the Earth's history? We'll see what happens. So then finally we will look at challenges in future climates in Africa. Two possibilities. One, climate change induced by human activities through production of greenhouse gases, or climate change through hemispheric systems. You know, the El Nino, the NAO, those of you who have done the climate as a subject, you would know some of those, and we will explain them. So I will just merely define certain concepts. First, that climate change as a concept has multiple meanings. It is not clearly differentiated from changing weather. Somebody would just go out and look and say there are floods coming. I would say, oh, we are suffering climate change. And is that really the case, or that is just a weather event? Climate change involves shifts from one extreme to another, and consistently for a particular period of time, which is a decade of tens of years and 50 years, 100 years, that is centuries, that certain events change, and we will explain this, how it happens. Then we have natural versus human-induced drivers that trigger the changes. Okay, if now we produce greenhouse gases today in 21st century, what about before this period? many thousands of years ago. There was no industrial development. Were greenhouse gases produced those times? Carbon dioxide is always produced, of course, because of volcanicity and so forth. But how would we explain that? And we'll talk about this. More accurately, therefore, what we deal with is climate variability. Most of you who are studying climate change in relation to some kind of production system, livelihoods, you are dealing with climate variability. Your data is unlikely to be decadal. In other words, you will not see the 10-year variation. You might have wet season and dry season sample, and then you say climate change. That actually is not climate change. That is climate variability. Then how do we know that the changes have occurred? Well, from environmental history perspectives, we can make a guess, a good guess, using what we call proxy indicators. Proxy indicators are indicators that you do not necessarily measure directly, but indirectly they can inform you, and we'll see what some of those proxy indicators are. For example, tree ring. Dendrochronology is the most important study or proxy indicator for climate change, because trees grow continuously, and each growth period it lays a ring, and during dormancy period the rings are very narrow, whereas during growth period the rings are much wider, and therefore by calculating this and relating it to chronological times, that is time known or certain events known, you will try to find out and make an explanation why is it that during this particular period the rings are narrower, which means the conditions were harsher, whereas during this period the rings were much wider, which means there was fast growth taking place. Conditions were suitable for tree growth. Others are soil core, and it gives you the same information, because if you are to dig the soil, you come through different layers. The most recent layer, which is laid recently, and then at the bottom, the one that was laid about 200 or 300 or 400 years ago, and we'll see what happens. So the proxy data includes tree rings, soil cores, pollen deposits. Pollen is a very interesting environmental footprint. It leaves, the pollen grain lasts for thousands of years. And for those who are expert in analysis of pollen grain, and mostly these are paleontologists and archaeologists, they would be able to date different pollen grain at different levels of those sedimentary core systems. Some pollen grains are found at certain stage far down, whereas others are on top, and they are of different plant species or plant genus. Then you would be able to make that deduction. So this information combined gives you some kind of indication about past environmental history. But this is only proxy. Others are, of course, changes in lake levels. Even the ancient Egyptians knew this very well. They had something called Nilometer in the Nile, at the Nile Delta, where they graded different levels of floods. If it is below 16 picas, they call it picas, the floods will not be sufficient to kind of flood the irrigation system. When it is 25 picas, that is really ideal. So these are marked. So, and that is proxy. Today now, I think there are some records that exist about these ancient records done by the ancient Egyptians about the Nilometer, and that can be read. So imagine you are standing on top of that landfall or land collapse, whatever it is called. It shows you different layers, sedimentary layers, different soil types, and these are of different ages And your pollen grain would be found in different levels from the top to the bottom. And that gives you a very interesting changes about phonological changes of, they call it a palynologic pollen studies, particularly those people who do this. It gives you a very clear fingerprint of past environment. And it provides you with an idea of the vegetation history of that particular region. And most of the time, these type of studies are representative, not only local, but also regional. Because you can have several of these profiles in different places, and you might come up with comparable information that occur at different periods. And changes in lake levels are probably most commonly used by geographers and archaeologists also. And that is probably very interesting. The East Africa Rift Valley is really, if you call our library of past climate, if you want to know about past climate changes, then you need to go and understand changes in these lake levels along the Rift Valley. And there are several studies that have done this actually. Very interesting studies there. So, these kind of studies, combining different subjects, using proxy indicators, looking at the environment at a larger scale, gives you what is called historical ecology. You try to understand about the ecology in the perspectives of history. The ecology changes during historical periods. And that is the kind of information that you have. And then that also gives you information such as adaptational changes, how societies respond to these changing environments, or changing weather systems, or changing climate, whichever is the case. And these past ecological studies can be seen from both spatial distribution of indicators, the proxy indicators, or the temporal variation of those indicators, and so on, and drawing on interdisciplinary sources, combining ecology, anthropology, archaeology, and so forth, then we can be able to understand how societies have been able to cope with the environment in the past, changes in the environment in the past. Historical ecology, therefore, concerns with long-term human environmental interactions, not something happening recently. What is our goal in this lecture? We want to examine about adaptation to climate change. I am repeating myself here. I have said we have to be very careful about what we mean by climate change, but I will define this. Climate change from perspective of early pastoralist societies, and consider what lessons the past may offer in terms of adaptation to future climate changes. The question is, why pastoralism? Why are we interested so much in pastoralism when we talk about climate change? The truth of the matter is that pastoralism is really the product of climate change, as you will see in this lecture. And from that perspective, therefore, because they give us some information of what happened in the past and what is happening now, and likely to happen also in the future, and therefore, being the product of climate change, therefore, it would be interesting to see how societies respond to these changes, both in terms of species diversification, in terms of different breeds of livestock that comes up, and so forth. So, if pastoralism is the product of climate change, therefore, ongoing discussion predicts that pastoralism is more likely to suffer. And this is where you want to question. If it is the product of climate change, why do we think that pastoralism is more likely to suffer under current climate change events, or the way it is described? And we'll see whether I'm contradicting myself here or not. So our vision is to present facts on climate change adaptation, which are often overlooked. But the subject matter is a bit broad, and you will forgive me. Now let's look at this scheme. This is a very broad scheme, global, if you wish. I will not be able to present everything, but think of drawing a pedestal or timeline through historical periods. And you stand at one period, and then the end is also at another period. But these periods are divided into smaller sub-periods. And during these sub-periods, something happened which influenced the environment and the society. Think of a period about 12,000 years before present. Before present, that refers to about 1954 going backwards. And why archaeologists did this, I am sure we have an ecologist here. You would be able to tell us. The wet Holocene, the environment globally was very wet, extremely wet. So what were human adaptations like? What were people doing about that time? We'll discuss this. Then this period dried up. There was a drying up of this period, about 4,500 before present. It's called the Great Warming, or the warming period. This history is not very well known, but paleontologists and archaeologists would try their best to give us some information. But after 1100 AD, things become clear because we have certain events, societal events, environmental events combined together, and we can say, okay, this is what might have happened. And I will just give you two examples which are not necessarily in Africa, but it's, if you read Jared Diamond collapse, you will be able to see this. About the Easter Island and the Anasazi. Those of you who come from the US, who comes from the US here? Yes, New Mexico, Utah State, the whole of that region, that panhandle is the home of Anasazi. The Anasazi were building cities about 1100 AD. And if you are to look at Albuquerque today and compare the physical archival material of the Anasazi today, you would be really surprised. They have story buildings, of course, in the valleys and hanging rocks and so on. So, if you come to Africa, the period between 1300 AD and 1500 AD was period of chaos, period of migration. The Bantus, the Kushites, this group and that group, they were migrating from whenever they are, and they were moving in different directions. There's war and so on. Then if you come to Europe, there is a period called Little Ice Age, from actually 1300 to 1700. The whole of Europe was frozen. And Ian, you are lucky that you are not born at that time. So ice and so forth. So it's a very difficult period. But of course, this period, you can also, historians will tell you there are lots of other things that might have happened, from Black Death to others and so on. But in East Africa, we know European imperialism came in at the end of the late, well, they came actually, if you include the Portuguese, they were here about 16th century. And then by late 19th century, the Europeans have already carved up the African continent, African communities into groups and so forth. And of course, this is not the discussion of this subject, this particular lecture, but just to give you an overview. Then you have present. So if you are lucky to have lived during this period, or be a good academic that you have read the material from the wet Holocene to the dry Holocene to the Little Ice Age, then to the present, and so on, then you would actually come across a lot of very interesting materials. 19th century was chaos for Africa. East Africa was a period of pastoral collapse, the Rinderpest, you know. Then wars, tribal wars. Various pastoralist communities were expanding. In fact, the war of the Pastoral Empire, it's only told about the Mongols, but in the Horn of Africa, actually, there was a pastoral empire in the present-day Jubaland. that conquered the whole of the coast of East Africa and dominated much of the coast and interior. And then, of course, the Maasai, everybody knows about Maasai, and so on. But that's a different story. What I'm trying to tell you is that if you want to think about your subject in time depth, there are many steps that you see. There are many events that occur. You don't look at only your ecology, but you want to see what might have influenced changes in that ecology. It could be actually tribal movements, warfare, and other things, and colonialism, imperialism, and so forth. So there are many factors. So this is why I think this summer school is good for you, because it helps you to go beyond your narrow disciplinary studies. You will be looking at multidisciplinary studies, and by so doing, you would be understanding bits of everything else. And you don't necessarily learn this in class, but you can learn on your own because a lot of references are available. So now we come to the Horn of Africa, the time frame from the Holocene, humid and wet periods, through arid phases of climate change during evolution of pastoralism. And that is really what we will focus on. And I will say less about the humid Holocene, but more later we will talk about the dry period of the Holocene, a little bit about the 19th century, 20th century, the 1900, and the present would be the end of the lecture. Oops. Okay. So let's put our thinking into perspectives. I've said a lot of things already. Some so not, it doesn't look that they are related, but they are if you look at closely. So the assumption is, prevailing thinking of climate ecologists, particularly today, is that the arid and semi-arid lands of the world are at greater risk of climate change. That might be true, but also there could be alternative explanation. The past, if we look at the timeline we have shown, informs us on how pastoral societies developed in response to those variability of climate events, particularly availability of food, availability of water, shelter, and so forth. So let us imagine a situation about humid Holocene period. It was not necessary for people to have livestock because food was plentiful. You could fish, you could kill wildlife, and so on. So we had a population of hunter-gatherers, not farmers or pastoralists. And this mobile band of nomadic hunter-gatherers were responding to climate events in their own way, because the climate events affect the distribution of food sources. And they just don't survive, but they actually leave their footprints of those events, those variability, and how they are adapted. And that is what I want to spend some time on. And let's go back to the Holocene period, and we have some evidence from hunter-gatherers, mobile hunter-gathering families in small groups, plenty of food around. But of course, the climate is changing. When I say climate is changing, it's not, I'm not talking of 10 years or 20 years, centuries, actually. So the animals they were hunting was called bos. You know bos is cattle, right? But the primigenus is the primitive cattle. So they were hunting. Looks like some of the antelopes that we have around. So the first attempt to adapt to changing climate from humid to dry Holocene was actually to domesticate some of the wild animals the Bos primigenials that they were hunting. This was the first cow. How do we know? The ancient pastoralists, Neolithic pastoralists, rock art pastoralists, left drawings of these animals on the rocks where they rested. We'll talk about this more. But then if you compare these engravings done on rock caves across Sahelian and the Horn of Africa in different places, you would find evolution of livestock managed by the ancient pastoralists, Neolithic pastoralists, rock art pastoralists. They came to Bos Taurus. Bos Taurus is not very much adapted to dry conditions, but is more manageable than Bos primigenius. Bos primigenius is almost a wild animal, wild cow. So this is small Bos Taurus was kind of domesticated. It's more manageable. It's able to, you can manage herds. Then that also changed over time until we have Bos indicus, the one with humps now, and the horns and so forth, and then the modern cattle, like the Borana breed. Now you're going for quality. And these are all done by human civilizations over time. Who did what, of course, is still can be, you can have various hypotheses, and there are explanations for this. And in this lecture, actually, there are some important references that I have provided. And the lecture notes that I have come from those references. So it will be wonderful for those of you, if you can find those references, when you go back to your university or the library, look up those references. You would be able to see more. So there was the first phase and the third phase and the fourth phase. So the first phase was the Holocene complex societies. The nomadic hunter-gatherers found that their population was growing bigger, and therefore they needed more internal organization and external defense of their resources. That's why they are called complex societies. They were thinking beyond killing an antelope and roasting the meat that day, but they are thinking of how do we, take care of our population given these changing conditions that probably it is becoming more rare to find one particular type of food which was favored at the time. So complex societies began to emerge. It was during this particular period that hunter-gathering was mixed with domestication of livestock. And until very recently, that's what most pastoralists do, actually. They do gather food, wild fruits, and also occasionally kill wildlife, and so on. But that is combined with pastoralism. And we will see later, particularly when we talk about coastal interior trade, how hunting became a very critical source of economy to the pastoralists in the Horn of Africa. If I forget, you remind me. Now, the work of Eret and Wadov are probably one of the most influential, talking about the domestication of animals in Africa. They claim that actually domestication of cattle preceded farming. Farming is for more sedentary communities. But there is also an argument that actually farming per unit land is more productive than having several heads of cattle. So that can be argued. But farming requires more complex, more organization, more knowledge of which type of crops are productive under what conditions. So the second phase was about 11,000 to 9,000 before present, when the primitiveness that I mentioned, domestication began. And later, of course, followed by Bostaurus and so on. How do we know this? The interesting thing is that if one looks at the rock art across Sahelian Africa, all the way through Gashbarka into Eritrea, into northern Somaliland, and actually these pictures, not some of these, but I will show you some, which are taken from Somaliland, have been, so to say, this rock art done by ancient pastoralists are really old. And archaeologists have used methods to kind of date them, but we will not be talking about about the dating of these paintings. But what we are saying is that if you are to compare different rock caves from Algeria, Talil, the desert now, and the rock art in Algeria, you look across the Sahel region, all the way to Gashbarka, Eritrea, to Somaliland, and part of Ethiopia, you would actually see certain similarities shared, both in terms of style of drawing, representation. The question is, why are styles similar, and why are representations similar, if it is? A good example would be the photo below. We have 3 figurines and then pulling a cow. That gives us an information about the management, okay? These fellows are managing. So this cow is very important. It has big udder, which means they get a lot of milk from that particular cow. And there are other pictures also that you can get more information. So they describe pastoral behavior in relation to environmental changes during this period, particular period we are referring to. And you can see from the pictures shifts from hunting to foraging and pastoralism, because you can find wild animals which are hunted in the same picture, but in another panel you find domesticated animals, which means that the person who was drawing this is concerned about both the wild animal which they hunted, they like hunting, like the giraffe, for example, and at the same time they would have cattle. So both of them are important in that particular case. But they tell us something about how changes in the environment influence their behavior in terms of the types of animals they hunted. And that the types of animals is shown by representations that we have in the iconography of the rock art. So domestication of stock and agriculture helped them to develop complex societies. They have enough food. Therefore, they are able to organize themselves and think more broadly about their way of living. What do we know? The bands of nomads engraved messages on rocks with iconographies of the rock art, informing us their adaptive strategies to environmental and societal changes. So those people, those individuals who have studied rock art, I haven't myself, I just read. So I just to give you a disclaimer. I'm no expert in this, but I have read and I've written about it. That's what it means by you reading widely and knowing more. You cannot be probably an expert, but you can be able to explain something that has happened. So that's what we have done. The types of livestock showed their choices. The choices of animals which shifted during different climate events. There are clear regional linkages from one part of the Sahel to Gashbarka to Eritrea to Somaliland. Actually, that is the path taken by the migration of pastoralism. Pastoralism was organized first in the Sahara Desert, and it is from there only after the Sahara dried up. Then the pastoralists moved into the Nile Valley, and from there across into Gashi-Berka, into the Horn of Africa. Only later, about 4,500 before the present, they moved into East Africa. East Africa was actually late. One could explain. So this is the Dambali rock art. There's a lady, I don't know if you read that book. There's a lady who wrote some very interesting book. I haven't seen the book, but I have read many of the papers in the book. And she describes this Dambali rock art. And you can see in this article a goats, sheep, some snakes, cows with no head, and so on. Each one of these, if you are an anthropologist, you could be able to explain what these figurines really represent. Evidence from Somaliland, therefore, gives us first evidence of sheep and goat paintings, representation of humpless and headless cattle. Other faunas indicated are giraffes, dogs, antelopes, snakes, and turtle. Giraffe is for hunting, dogs are for hunting. Antelopes are also for hunting, and the snakes, of course, are dangerous. And turtle, I have no idea what it is, but those are the things you see. And the pictures show the hunting scene. A herder or hunter throwing a spear or a projectile at an animal. So what are these symbolic representations of the rock art pastoralists, therefore? They depict environmental change by choice of animal breeds that they breed. I've already mentioned something about Bos indicus and Bos taurus. So in different engravings, you would find different animals in different paintings. That is an indication that the pastoralists, these Neolithic pastoralists, are making different choices. It also depicts economic habits in terms of hunting and gathering and herding, and most rock arts in the Sahara and the Horn of Africa show similar styles. Evidences are rituals, headless animals. Some slaughtering work was done. And in certain cases, actually, they describe people jumping over their art. And in some part of the Omo Valley, there is a custom where people jump over over cattle as part of their cultural practices. So pastoral production is closely linked to environmental variability, as shown by the early rock art pastoralists, different animals representing different changes in the climate. Water, among the resources, is very critical for depicting some of these changes, and we'll talk about it later. So if we take the animals which are domesticated, Bos taurus, for example, requires water more frequently, and therefore they are less tolerant. So if you are talking about climate change, it means as the climate becomes drier, you would have less of Bos taurus, but more of Bos indicus, because Bos indicus are more tolerant to changes in climate. The third phase is rise in social complexity. The societies are becoming complex. They have moved from hunter-gatherers into large herding communities based on, and actually differentiating by this time, the types of species of livestock they want to specialize in. Others have small stock, sheep and goats. Camels will come later, at a later date. Cattle came first, but camels came later. And we will actually see why and what are the evidences that is then the case. And during this particular period, actually, during the third phase, we can also already see some evidence of trade. The porcelain, the pottery of different, representing different cultural situations are found in different places, which means that they are transferred from one group to another, and you can see people are exchanging materials and particularly in terms of poetry. So, by 4,500 before present, pastoralism became most preferred source of livelihood. The environment now is drier. The humid Holocene is gone. The wet Holocene, of course, is gone. The drier Holocene, we are towards the end of the drier Holocene. Subhumid zone herders combined pastoralism. If you are living in highlands, they combine cultivation and pastoralism. And that is the same practice that they do today. So, we can actually have some pictorial representation of these movements from the Sahara. As I mentioned, the Sahara Desert dried up, and by 6,000 before present, the population was actually leaving that region because it was becoming very, very dry. And then by 4,000 before present, we already have sheep and goats, and you can see that picture, the way it shows, it goes not necessarily through Lake Turkana, but I think it is towards, a little bit towards the Horn of Africa and so on, until they reach Southern Africa, where the Khoisan, what are they called? Somebody remind me of their name. You know, the pastoralists before the white people came in. And what do you call them? Yeah? Yes. They still keep their livestock. And actually, they have some breeds of goats, like the Boer goats originally were produced by them, but then they, I think through the white settlers, bred them, crossed them with at different levels and produced what we have now as Boer goats. So we can sum this up now. Evidence of Neolithic pastoralist migration, evidence from rock art, from across the Sahel, 7,500 to 6,500 before present. And these are periods of mega droughts. I don't know if we haven't actually seen a mega drought. A mega drought will take 10 years. The Horn of Africa has had some of these, and they are recorded from the 8th century when there was a mega drought. All the water sources dries up, including the Nile. The Nile also, to a large extent, dries up, and other water sources dry up. These are periods of mega droughts. Others, smaller drought, 5 years, 4 years, these are normal. We'll come to this later. So, it is about this time, the scarcity of fodder and water made mobility a necessity of pastoralism. And so if we look at this, then 3 factors come in. 4 factors come in. First, pastoralism as a production system is related to space because it moves through countries, through landscapes, through ecosystems. That is the space. Time, at one time they are here, at another time they are here, there, and so forth. And then combining all these, they develop knowledge of some sort. And that is what makes pastoralism, I think, a very interesting subject to read. So from 10th to 12th centuries, Horn of African pastoralists have assumed the present day structure that they have. Species of livestock they keep, types of management in relation to space and time, and the kind of knowledge systems they have developed. They have moved from the ancient pastoral, the rock art pastoralists. They are able to manage their environment. The environment are managed in such a way that you have what is called wild ecosystem, wild landscape, and then domesticated landscape. That is a very interesting concept, actually, if you look at what is wild landscape and what is a domesticated landscape. Of course, if you walk across the world, so here, much of it is domesticated now. A wild would be where pastoralism have not ventured for quite a long period of time. Maybe Camp Simpire would be a wild landscape one day, because if there are no cows here, the vegetation composition and structure would change. And that can be called wild ecosystem or domesticated ecosystem compared to others. So some of these environmental changes, therefore, are influenced by humans using fire to change the landscape. But that use of fire has multi-purposes, including killing of pests, facilitating the growth of suitable grasses or vegetation, for that matter. And it also alters competition between different vegetation species. And pastoralists know this. If you put fire into this rangeland, it is this type of vegetation or grass that comes up. If you disallow the fire, this is the kind of vegetation. The land becomes wild, therefore, and you get bush encroachment. So settlements are abandoned. And this is very interesting about pastoralism. I think those people doing archaeology or pastoralism, of course, there are already some very interesting work done in Laikipia, you know this. And people have originally used things like burial places, cairns, and so forth. But actually, you can think of the whole of this landscape as a surface where pastoral camps have been there some 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 20 years ago, a few weeks ago, and so on. They spotted all over the place. And if there's a way of knowing this and mapping this, you would be able to see different spaces and times of pastoral distribution across landscapes. And that is quite interesting. And these movements of pastoralists and the use of fire and so on, it creates an environmental memory. I did recently a little study in a region called Ambalo, and we carried out road transects covering 62 kilometers from the junction of Adadi all the way to Ambalo and beyond to a place they call Chera. And I had 4 herders with me, and I asked the herders to read the landscape the way they would normally do in their own tradition. And I had my own ecology. I'm an ecologist, by the way. I'm a range ecologist. So I had also forms where I was recording ecological indicators. And the pastoralists were also recording their own anthropogenic indicators, like whether this landscape is good for cattle. It was, what is it now? What does it look now? Has the potential of this landscape gone down, or it is the same as before, and so forth? There are many questions around that. And you get some fascinating knowledge. And I hope that during this particular summer school, you will have an opportunity to work with pastoralists through landscape and ask them to tell you exactly what those landscapes are about, whether the vegetation has changed for better or for worse, and for which livestock it is more suited than the other, and so on. And those recorded together gives you some very interesting information. So, and they give you also the annual grazing cycles, which is quite clear, and most of you are familiar with this. I will say less on this. So landscape as a source of memory. Landscapes become memory. It's a source of memory. Landscape is not just earth. It's not just a piece of ground, a piece of trees, and so on. Every landscape has a name. It has an identity. Just like the cartographers, the map makers, you know, they have a name. They call this, sometimes misspelled, but this is the name of this, and that is the name of this. The pastoralists, for every 100 meters you walk, you will find different names. And the names normally are related to soils, the historical event that occurred there. Either somebody important was buried there or died there, or there was a warfare around there, and some important event of memory is recorded. Every landscape has a memory. It has identity. and that is quite important for pastoralists. I come to a subject matter which is extremely interesting, but we don't have much time for this. The Horn of African pastoralists now are well established. We have said they have differentiated into those keeping different livestock species, and also ethnic identities were emerging by that time. And the question is, pastoralists are not insulated societies. They are kind of integrated with the rest of the world. And this is precisely what happened to the Horn of African pastoralists. They have always been in contact with other groups from across the seas, as far as India, China. Of course, Arabia is just nearby. And so there's so much trade between the coast, those bringing in processed goods, and then the pastoralists bringing in from the interior their own kind of cargo, and these are exchanged. And in this process, you would find different arrangements, different societies playing different roles. You have brokering societies, groups, the urban. The Somalis know about the urban. They're brokers. Without them, you cannot go into the interior. And they are the ones who give you safe passage. And that is important. And so this is interior trade. It is a way of adaptation climate change or climate event, let me call it that way. And because by kind of supplementing the benefits they get from the imports in exchange with their own produce, they are able to live better. This is a crucial aspect of climate change, therefore, we can say. Pastoralism is not isolated, as I said. This coastal interior contact is quite important. The interior landscape is actually a landscape of diverse economies. If you are thinking of the Horn of Africa, from Somaliland, go to Ethiopian highland. You go through different geographical regions. And each of these geographical regions are occupied by different ethnic groups. So if the Indian bring in their goods in Berbera, using those, there are these seasonal caravans, huge seasonal caravans that the Somalis organize. So those from the highlands in Ethiopia or the rest of Horn of Africa would be handed over to the urban. And these caravans are organized until they go to the coast. They exchange the material they have for what the Indians were saying, the cowrie shells, the metal products, clothes, and some other beauty things. And of course, in exchange, they will have leopard skins, tusks, including human cargo, of course, and very robust system. And during difficulty periods, the pastoral societies rely on this. And for the brokering communities, because they control these trade systems, actually they become very influential. Without them, the coastal merchants cannot get into the interior. The coastal merchants need these brokering institutions in order for them to get the raw materials like coffee and so forth, gold, and so on. So pastoralism played four important roles, and we'll just mention them. They supplied transport, of course. They are the ones who had camels. I did mention that, remind me about camel, but I think you can raise that in your question. They also developed brokering institutions. I've mentioned that. They provided raw materials for trade, and they manufactured trade goods. Pastoralism also had actually their own ways of making things, products from their livestock, the hides and skins, the metalworks, and various other things. And particularly in the Horn of Africa, this is a very rich environment where different ethnic groups, different civilizations with different technical knowledge are mixed. If you are in southwestern Ethiopia, for example, the consul would be making clothes, warm clothes. And the Borana would sell their cows. They butter them, actually. They butter exchange. For different rolls of clothes, they get a bull of a different size and so on. And then the coastal Arabs would need ivory. This ivory is hunted by hunter-gatherers, or we call them wata, and they sell them to the brokering institutions, and the brokering institution sell them to the coastal merchants. So this is a very sophisticated system of operation, and that is part of adaptation, actually. So there's a book, actually. I forgot what it is. Title is. It's based on the Red Sea, and it covers about this history of coastal trade involving pastoralists over a long period of time, but sorry for my lapse of memory there. So these caravans organize exchange systems, set rules on what need to be exchanged and how much. How materials even exchanged have certain rules. And as a child, of course, I had the experience. You know, these days you have a metal ruler. If you want to buy a sheet, a red sheet or a white sheet of cloth, you get, so a herder comes into a shop and says you want 7 armpits. They don't know what meter is, so it's 7 armpits. And the pastoralists are quite clever. They go around the market and find the tallest person with a very long hand. And you see, and so the shopkeeper gives him the piece of cloth, and then he, 1, 2, 3, and so on. But of course now they use these meters, so they get less. So everything is measured. It's something fascinating. But of course, different goods are valued differently. For the interior pastoralists, things like metal. And you will see why metal is important. In my next, I suppose, lecture, I will mention a little bit about this. So there are market transactions, creating brokering institutions. I have mentioned this several times. There are medium exchange. If you have ivory of certain weight, then how many bulls would you have? And this actually came out very interesting during the 19th century when there was a disaster and pastoralists were affected. The pastoral system collapsed. So pastoralists turned into hunting, gathering, and killing of elephants. The main reason was ivory became the currency of recovery of pastoralism. In the coast of Africa, among the Orma, they call it Abba Afri. Abba is father. So Abba Afri is the father of the 4. What that meant is that if you had an ivory, you could carry that ivory to somewhere along the Somali coast and trade with your ivory, and you get a calf. But it's just one calf. But at home, there are many of the relatives who don't have any cows. So a calf is given to 4 people. One takes the first pregnancy or whatever it is, the first calf. The second person takes the second calving. The third person, the third calving, and the fourth person remains with the original cow. That's why it's called a Bahavri. So the exchange rate became very critical. And but there's a lot to be said about this, and this is one very interesting one. among the Majarten in Somaliland, the late 19th century, there was a very interesting historical study about the shipwreck. The ship is blown, of course, and then on these coral reefs, they wreck the coral reef, but then the ship are loaded with goods. So some pastoral communities, among the Majarten, for example, became very powerful because they had access to this cargo, which they looted, of course, and then control, now selling into the interior market. And it's some very interesting study. So I think we should end this here. So the coastal interior trade in East Africa had, of course, begun by 650 AD. I'm kind of going back. The Egyptians, Arabs, and the Indians created this coastal interior global trade with pastoralists of the interior. And then the interesting thing is that you have the seaboard colonies, small towns, settlements. And of course, some archaeological work has been done for Somalia, and it's very interesting. Some of these ruins were described by early European travelers, the 19th century European travelers. Some of them actually existing, and they can describe them, of course. I don't know, they are not talking about climate change, of course, but in terms of societies that existed, they were urbanized, they are different from the pastoralists and so forth. So coastal interior trade conduits of introduction of Islam, of course, is very much known. It's a seasonal affair. Berbera, the seasonal caravan, until the British squashed. And in East Africa, of course, there are caravan trades, and those of you who have read, and I will be first here. So these shifts in trade came actually about late 19th century. Now what happened? The pastoralists took control of both the interior and the coastal trade. And that is why groups like the Orma in Tana River in Kenya became a military power from 14th century to late 19th century before they were broken by the Somalis, the Darod invasion of Jubaland. They were controlling the production of, the collection of ivory and then selling it to the market. It is only their rules. They get certain percentages. Even other groups who were hunting in their own territory gives back some of the income from the ivory to these ethnic groups. So that's how they control the trade. Now, I want to digress a little bit and go back to my method. The thing about method, I said one of the most important products was metallic subjects. After the wet Holocene, during the wet Holocene, of course, there was no need of digging wells because water was everywhere. But as the environment dried, particularly in the drier part of the Horn of Africa, water scarcity became a major problem for pastoralism. And it is in this region that what I call hydraulic societies emerged. These hydraulic societies are societies with some very unique knowledge of water. Of course, there are many hypotheses on where did they get this idea from. Is it through the caravan, through the coastal trade, therefore from outside onto the Horn of Africa? Or is it an indigenous technology? Of course, an interesting example is in 19th century when we have explorers traveling through the Horn of Africa. They visited wells, deep wells. Those of you who have gone to southern Ethiopia know what I'm talking about, and we'll see a picture actually. in a few moments' time. The interesting thing is that these wells are not like any other well you have ever seen. If you want to enter a well, for example, you go for 800 meters. So the question is, they have ramp wells. These are wells which are dug, and you walk. The cattle walk into the well, actually. So they walk for about 800 meters, and then it drops down into the wellhead, and then the wellhead goes down another 40 meters into the ground, where you have chains of people lifting water using, before they call it giraffe basket, but now they use these plastic things. So the time is not with us, so I will just go through this very rapidly. So as aridity increased, therefore knowledge of water technology came up. If you raise questions, I will be able to answer this. And the curiosity of this...
On an upland plain in the southeastern corner of Ethiopia live the Borana people. Their society too centers on the struggle for a daily supply of water, but under completely different natural conditions, and in consequence with other social implications. Here there are neither rivers nor glaciers, and from October to March there is no rain. It's strange to be in a landscape arid as far as the eye can see, and listen to sounds emanating from vast herds of cattle enveloped in clouds of dust. 300,000 people, close on 1 million head of cattle, and an assortment of camels, goats and horses must consume enormous quantities of water. But where do they find it? Every day, for months on end, cattle can be seen being herded across the plain and down into man-made ravines. Out of sight, there are a number of deep, year-round wells, or tulas as they are called, on which the community is wholly dependent. This man is at the foot of a human chain that starts 40 meters above.
Okay, I will be very quick here. There's something I call socio-memory. How do pastoralists know about climate events that occur? I will not go into this, but I will use an example of the Gabra. And this data is based on some historical work done, oral historical work done by Father Tablino and, what is the other name? Two historians, actually, who have done this. And what they did is, in their reports, describe, because the Gabra have a different calendar system from the Boran, for example. The weekly calendar, Monday up to Sunday, they have different names in the Gabra terminologies. And this also corresponds with variation of names of years, the Sabtiya, the Alcininia, and so forth. And these historians described what happened during particular period, and this corresponded with period of 1896, for example, when these records began. Then they would say during that particular period the Algana dispersed in this area. Or during this Alcinin of this, they said there was smallpox. During this other year, which has their names, they did this. So what I did was to kind of graduate these descriptions into ordinal scales, where the the stress years, and I call it some stress index, I think. Stress years are given a minus, and the more positive years are given a positive number. So if there's a climate change event, what one would think is that things will be becoming worse, and therefore you get a kind of higher rise at the beginning, and then things becoming worse, and then the graphs are dropping. But here what we have is that things go from normal to abnormal, and so on, in that cycle. And the Gabras calculate this in terms of 50 years, 30 years, 50 years, and 100 years. They know exactly what happened during this particular period. And this is described in that reference, and that reference is given in the reference of the lecture. So what are the challenges, therefore, to pastoralism as far as climate change is concerned in Africa? Climate of southern borders of Sahara fluctuated between wet and dry years. Something interesting in Sahel, as those of you who are ecologists and also historians know, there's something called the greening of the Sahel. The Sahel is becoming more green. So on one hand, we are talking about climate change. On the other, climate change for the worse, assuming that climate change brings very difficult periods for pastoralists. But on the other, we have a positive change taking place. The region suffered from disastrous drought, of course, in the 1970s, 1979 specifically, when the cattle in that region died in huge numbers, and that affected the populations. And there are both those narratives about the climate change affecting this, and then there are counter narratives that actually climate change might not occur uniformly around the world. There are some places that might benefit from climate change, while others become worse. But that's a debate you will consider. And we have used the Gabra as an example. The Boran count the time cycles of climate events in 40-year, 100-year. 100-year is called Ballet. They will say Baliti. Baliti means it broad events occur at 100 years. That is when a mega drought would be expected. And then another mega drought expected in 280 years. So what are the evidences? Pastoralism as a way of life and means of production has continued to adjust to climate changes or climate events. Unlike some of the ancient river valleys, like the Indus, and you know about those river valleys where populations collapsed, pastoralism never totally collapsed and disappeared. Even when they collapsed, they recovered again. So the degree to which it relies on variety of resources during periods of stress varies from one group to the other. So to conclude, I want to say two important points. In climate change analysis, the tendency is to assume that the turbulent climates of prehistoric periods were triggered by regional climate events and were independent of human activities, as opposed to present climates that human activities contribute to global climate change, like the greenhouse gases. While we appreciate the adaptation to future climate change would differentiate from those of the past, largely due to socio-political transformation, we cautiously suggest that the past is precisely the knowledge base we need for our understanding. And some interesting references are given. Bullet, for example, it tells you about the camel, and the first ID was introduced into the Horn of Africa, and that we can talk about it later if you wish. Was written the Civilization of Africa History up to 1600, and then Brian Fagan, Great Warming, a beautiful book, and then my own book, where most of this lecture actually came from, and then Word of Unshield. Thank you.
The water water levels are rising. If you can help us understand more about that.
Okay, the implications of the Rift Valley Lake rising for the library, yeah?
Question of the East Africa lakes. This is a subject matter which has interested archaeologists for many years and climatologists. The East Africa lakes have been rising and falling over many years. And these records are left in the proxy indicators, in the sediments and whatever, the fauna, fossils and so on. And using these, it is possible to reconstruct past climates. So the only way we can get information is that these changes had occurred over many, many millions of years ago, and it will continue to do so. Even if you get like, is it Baringo rising now? But it had fallen at one time, and it will fall also. The lake levels will fall. So it is not continuing to rise, but it will fall again. Because that is the cyclic event that had occurred. And if you go back to the historical records, paleontological records, you will get that information.
The history is very interesting to understand the cyclic pattern of events. My question is, can you use that cyclic pattern to focus the future and do something about the future?
How would the pastoralists use cyclic events? And this is really the living of the pastoralist. Most pastoralists in East Africa or in the Horn of Africa know the turn of events. And they have different local terminologies. And these local terminologies are used to predict the future. The pastoral, the Gabra, the Borana know, for example, what is likely to happen in the next 50 years during the cycle of this particular generation class and that the cycle of this timeline. So this helps actually to help them to think about the future, but what they do not have control on is the changes taking place on their land. Although they know the cyclic events, but the changes on the land they cannot control. That is under the control of the government, and thank you. I thank CRDD and other organizations for inviting me to this lecture. And I also, very impressed actually, thank the organization. And Peter, I think this is a fantastic way of organizing schools in these remote places, summer school. Thank you for the organization, that's very well done. And I did tell Hussein, the way this course was organized is fantastic. I think this will go a long way to benefit most of you. And finally, I want to say that this should not be one-off event. There should be a summer school from now on for the next 10 years, if there would be funding, of course, because you would find that after this 1 week, you would actually have learned much more and understood things in more complex ways and integrated ways than you had in your classes. Thank you so much.